I'm going to tell you a shocking but true story. Shocking, personal, and true that maybe these kids will suddenly bolt in their seats when they hear it. When I was about 6 years old, who's 6 here? Anybody? Raise your hand if you're 6. 6, okay. When I was about, anybody else? No, Larry, you're not 6 years old. When I was about 6 years old, I shot my brother in the eye. I thought that would get your attention. When I was at 6 years old, I shot my brother in the eye, not with a gun, God forbid, but with an arrow. But not with an arrow with a hard, sharpened tip, but with an arrow with a suction cup on the tip, which today makes me feel a little better about myself. What a piece of rubber can do to a man's humanity. I can only imagine how terrified I was. I can't remember. I remember the room so vividly. I remember the walls. I remember my brother being shot by me, clearly by accident because I was 6. As much as we may have fought and fought and fought and endlessly fought, the last thing I would have wanted to do was actually to shoot him in the eye with an arrow, even with a rubber tip. And over a couple of days, Gil said nothing. But his eye said a lot. It swelled. It grew red, infected, sore. And Gil suffered without blaming me until my parents grew more and more concerned and took him to the ophthalmologist. And the story as I remember it, maybe it's now apocryphal, but it's my story. What I remember is that Gil told the doctor that it was something, because my parents were standing there, maybe dust, maybe dirt, a fly, something got in his eye. But he never said, my brother shot me in the eye with an arrow. Until a certain point, when the wise doctor said, well, I'm going to take these drops, and if it's only dust or dirt, they won't hurt at all. And then my brother said, but my brother shot me in the eye with an arrow. I spoke last night about love. I ended that sermon talking about the imperative of love, and I want to show you by this an example of real love at an age when maybe if you'd asked me or asked my brother, do we love each other, we might have said resolutely no, because we fought over everything that we shared. Even that line that divided our bedroom, his and mine. Everything was an issue for a fight, for a rivalry, but ultimately what my brother knew before an age where he could learn it academically, as we might have later in life, he knew what it was to love. He showed me, and he shows you by that act those years ago, that he understood that to love means to put another person before yourself. And clearly I didn't, and clearly he did. When we look in our tradition of siblings, we have a rich tradition in the first book of the Torah, in Genesis. We begin with 2 famous brothers, Cain and Abel. And it doesn't end well, because within one generation of humanity, we already have fratricide. We have one brother killing the other brother. In the next generation, when we have Isaac and Ishmael later, or the sons of Abraham and the sons of Sarah and Hagar, Sarah's housemaid, which may have been a cause for some issues here between these brothers. One brother, Ishmael, gets driven out of the family home, sent away in favor of the other brother, Isaac. And then we know more, perhaps more fluently, the story of Esav and Yaakov, Jacob and Isaac, who it says as they were born, one was pulling on the heel of the other. So there was always already that connection and also that tension between these 2 siblings. And what we know soon after, only pages, or I should say paragraphs, or even lines after the story of their birth, the author of Torah skips forward to a pivotal moment. When Jacob, knowing the appetite of his brother Esau, steals his birthright for a bowl of soup. Maybe it's a reminder of our appetite's power over our wisdom. At the same time, maybe it's a reminder of what can come of those choices in our lives, those moments that resulted in that one of 20 years of estrangement, until ultimately those brothers embraced, weeping on each other's shoulders, realizing what they lost could never be gained again. It was a love of a brother, a sibling, a meaningful, powerful relationship truly a gift that they'd squandered for 20 years. The richest single story in the book of Genesis of brothers is the one that inspired Andrew Lloyd Webber to make a musical. It's the story of Joseph and his brothers. It's less about his coat and more about the relationship between Joseph and himself and Joseph and his siblings, and ultimately the relationship between Joseph and all of us, because all of us stand as a testament to the journey that he made. Joseph, if we remember in the beginning of the Torah portion, tells his brothers his dream. Now think about this choice. We all wake up and maybe we tell our siblings or our husband or wife, this is what I dreamt last night. Before I woke up, this is the last image that I had. Or maybe, if we're wise, we don't at times, because we realize maybe the pain or the worry that we might cause the loved ones in our lives. But Joseph, in his immature love and his mature love for himself, his own childhood narcissism, what Joseph does is he tells his brother that the image tells his brothers, perhaps at the breakfast table as we might, that his image and his dream of all of his brothers bowing down to him, like sheaves of wheat in the field, that they're all bowing toward him. I don't imagine it calls for a great breakfast. But in case that wasn't wise, we then realize that Joseph does it again and imbues more hatred in his brothers for himself. He distances himself from them from him, by telling them his next dream in which he sees himself as the center of their world, that ultimately, as will happen as we read Torah, they will bow down to him, they will serve him. But what we have to ask ourselves is, what is it about his dream interpretation? What does it show us about his character and about his capacity to love? Because I think when we go into Yom Kippur and come out of it this year, maybe what we can have is a more acute sense of what it means not only to love, but how we love as individuals. What our capacities are to be loving, to enact love, to bring love, to put love above our own needs at times, to elevate another soul above ours, so that we realize what it is to realize holiness. The only time when Joseph's dream interpretation emerges as a sign of his own generous love, his mature love, is, if you remember, when he ends up after the pit in which his brothers slave him to a pit. And I imagine that moment. I ask myself what it must have been like, because sometimes, other than knowing years in Torah, and sometimes a day, we know that a day passed. We don't know how many minutes passed, how many hours passed. I imagine Joseph at the bottom of an empty well and asking himself, is this a trick the brothers play, and are they coming back? And I imagine that moment when he realizes that their footsteps and their voices have disappeared, that they hated him so much that they actually left him there to die. And ultimately, the Torah says that they didn't leave him to die, but instead they come back, they sell him into slavery. And they sell him into slavery. He ends up again in another pit, in an Egyptian prison. And there he encounters a cupbearer and a baker. And if we think of those characters, it wasn't a wazir, it wasn't a governor, it was a cupbearer and a baker. It was two people who significantly to us had no power. But what Joseph does in that moment with them, and his encounter with them in prison, is he interprets their dreams. It's then that we realize that his dream interpretation isn't his own dreams. It's then that we realize that sometimes the greatest definition of love is when we take interest in the dreams of one another. Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassov, known as the Sassover Rebbe, he told a wise and beautiful story of love. Two Russian peasants sit in a tavern drinking, and one turns to the other and he asks his friend in his stupor, he says, "My friend, do you love me?" And the friend says, "Of course I do." And the next moment he says to him, "But do you know what pains me?" And his friend says, "No." And he says, "Then how can you say that you love me?" Sometimes Hasidic stories about old men in taverns don't translate, but if I tell you the same story, that a woman turns to her husband, or the man whom she loves, the man whom she thinks she knows, and who knows her, and says, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Yes," perhaps embracing her. And then maybe she looks him in the eyes and says, "Do you really know what pains me, what hurts me, what causes me the greatest pains in my life story?" And maybe he says, "No." And maybe she says, then how can you say that you truly and wholly love me? Love requires inquiry. It requires interest. It requires enough interest to know another person's pains and their dreams. When we read in the Torah that Adam knew Eve, we know that it's a euphemism for an intimate act between a man and a woman. But maybe it isn't just an act of prudery on the author's part. Maybe it's teaching us something about what intimacy means. That when it says that a man knew a woman in that context, it's saying that they took interest enough to know each other before they did that act of knowing. That wasn't a prerequisite for knowing, that knowing was what led to that intimacy. That maybe what they were telling us in that first story of Torah is that we have to take each other seriously before we share intimacy. And then we earn the right to intimacy with one another. The famed psychologist and thinker on thought, Abraham Maslow, taught many ideas of love. And one was two particular kinds or strands of love. One is what he called simply D-love, or deficient love, which is a love based on fulfilling our own needs. And think about that one for a moment. And the other is what Maslow called B-love. And B-love is what he called being love. And to put it simply, it's unselfish desire to give of yourself to another person. Or in The Road Less Traveled, the author M. Scott Peck said, it's being so willing to generously put another person's needs above your own so that they can grow. The rabbis teach us that there are two different kinds of love. One is love that is talui bedavar, something that is conditional. And the other is simply, as we know, lo talui bedavar, or what we would call in our parlance, non-conditional, unconditional love. It's what we might think of as mature love. Love that sees imperfection and loves despite it. I wonder when I look out and I see those of you who are celebrating 50 and 60 years of marriage, if you aren't a testament to mature love, because I know that you've seen imperfection in each other. And I realize when I stand in front of the ark with you with a talit wrapped around your shoulders to share a blessing, that you've already given each other the greatest blessing of forgiveness. Otherwise, you wouldn't reach 40 and 50 and 60 years. What I realize in my own life is it's so easy to see another person as different from ourselves, and therefore not realizing they have the same set of flaws. They just come out in different conditions, in different colors on their palette that they hold to paint their story. And our tradition says, look at each other and nurture each other with a generous love. Refine your soul by delving in the soul of another human being, by inquiring, by coming to know who they are at a level of their soul, by knowing what pains them, by knowing what elevates them, and by knowing what they dream. I suggested last night that there might be two other definitions of love, and one is a word in Hebrew, ahava. And we say ve'ahavta to God. We speak of God saying we should love God with ahava. And ahava we could call the noun of God, the God that, or I should say the noun of love, which is waiting to be discovered, which is love that is waiting to be experienced and appreciated. But I want to introduce you to a second word that has a different quality. And I mentioned it last night, and it's called chesed. And chesed has warmth. It has heat in a way that ahava might not. If ahava is in our mind and reminds us to love God through our acts, then chesed is what we find for one another, but not find it in ourselves, find it in our hands, because it can't exist inside unless it's translated to who we are through our acts. I know that if this was a sermon on the love of two brothers for one another, that I'd isolate those who don't have a brother, or, as I heard at the beginning of this service, who envy the relationships that we have. I know that if it was a love relationship story, a sermon about husbands and wives, then it wouldn't speak to everybody's experience of life. I'd escalate, or I should say, I would exclude some people from this story, and they'd read it as somebody else's and not theirs. But on this Yom Kippur, what I want to ask us to do is reflect on our own loving selves, on ourselves and our love for ourselves, because probably that love will be the greatest driver of our behavior in the new year. On our love for others, because it'll probably be what defines us and the greatest source of happiness in the new year. And in the synagogue, I ask you to think about your relationship and love for God, despite the challenges that God constantly throws in your way. Is the love that we have of ourselves conditional or unconditional? Do we look in the mirror as a teenager does and only see the spot and not see the face? Or can we see who we are and take a different glance at our lives? Can we look at our love for one another through a different lens and ask ourselves, instead of holding each other near for a moment, to step back and look at one another and realize what we have, what we've been given, what we've been blessed to hold, to share in our lives and call friend, and call companion, and call lover. I'm asking you to think about your life in terms of your love, whether it's childlike or mature. And I'm asking you at the same time to think in a different sense, to think of love for entities. Keith Elkin spoke beautifully about Israel this morning, and I'm so glad that he shared that and those thoughts and those ideas, because it's important that we hear them. But what I want to ask you in light of what Keith said is about your love for the state of Israel. Is it a childlike love that doesn't allow for imperfection, that walks away and abandons when we see an impurity, or is it a mature love that brings us to 50 and 60 years, or in our case, 63 years of a marriage to a people in a land that we call our own, that we say, Ki anu amecha. We are this people that calls ourselves plurally together, us. We unite ourselves not only with the people whose names we know in this room, but when we pray Israel, we pray for and with those people across the world who say, love us with our imperfections as we love you with yours. When we look at the Jewish people, do we only take pride in our great contributions to medicine and science and art and music and history and literacy, or do we also realize that we too have imperfections? We have the Madoffs that make headlines, that make us shirk. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves if because of that we should distance ourselves from the Jewish people or from the pride that we take in being called a Jew. Do we look in the mirror on this Yom Kippur and ask ourselves not only what we love, but what it is that we can do with our love? Because our tradition gives us a dichotomy to live with. At one point, it gives us 100 blessings a day, the rabbis gave us, so that 100 times a day we could simply be grateful for what there is, this piece of wood with the crack and the niche and the bits that are missing from it, but to realize its perfection. Every day to say a blessing for that bread, no matter how many days it's been sitting in the fridge or on a counter, but still to realize the blessing of bread. To look at each other and realize a blessing of living with this person and these people, this community that we can call ours. That when we say Valley Outreach Synagogue, one piece of it tells us where we are on this earth. Another piece of it tells us what we're about, which is outreach, reaching out and making bridges and connections to another. But another is that it connects us to an ancient people that we hold holy as family, that we make a synagogue with. When we look at ourselves in relation to each other, do we ask ourselves what our obligations are that will actually prove our love? Because love is a feeling never changed much except the heart that it held. But love in the hands of a lover is a person who's generous. That's a love that can transform our world. That's a love that this world and that boy and these kids need so desperately, not only directed to them, but modeled for them. I want you to look at the kids and imagine, look at them and realize that some of their gestures they've inherited. Not only their faces, because I see that knowing their parents. But look at their gestures. Look at how they stand. And they didn't necessarily come to this posture of themselves. They saw you modeling it. That became their gesture. That became their posture. So ask yourself then in this new year with more consciousness, what postures can I model for them? What gestures can I show them so that ultimately, instead of putting a hand on a hip, they'll put a hand out? They'll be the people who reach into this world and say, it's not enough to simply be content with it. I have to see my role in it and change it. That's our dichotomy. Not merely to see the world for its wealth of blessings, but to see the darkness so that we can bring light to it. It's the dichotomy of gratitude and dissatisfaction that we have to hold, one in each pocket. Gratitude for all that we have and dissatisfaction so that we realize it isn't enough the way I was today. It isn't enough the way that condition is. I need to do something about it.